Here we're going to sort of return to an interrogation of some of the deeper conversations and ideas around climate change and emotions and psychology. And with Blanche's work, how do we learn to live with climate change? How do we live with this unstable, unfolding, and at times unbearable reality that we're all navigating? So I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Blanche and also Brenda, who is one of our PSC volunteers who's going to be talking with Blanche this evening and asking her questions. So Dr. Blanche Verlie is a climate change educator and researcher, passionate about supporting people to engage with the emotional, ethical, and existential complexities of climate change. Her work centres around exploring how people, specifically relatively privileged people, do and how we could understand, relate, and respond to climate change, and the ways that we might better imagine and practice climate change education, communication, and engagement. She sees this work as foundational for all our efforts, small and grand, to cultivate climate justice. Blanche has worked primarily with undergraduate students and is passionate about young people's experiences of climate change and supporting their activism. Blanche has just started as a research fellow role in the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT, having recently completed a postdoctoral research fellow role at the Sydney Environment Institute. You can find out more about her research and writing and discover her wonderful book at her website, which I'm just going to pop in the chat now. And it is a wonderful book, and you can actually access it for free as well through Blanche's website. Okay, and Dr. Brenda Dobia is an experienced psychologist, educator, and social ecologist. She's passionately advocating for social change to address personal and planetary well-being and promote intergenerational equity. Brenda has a particular interest in supporting activists and teaching for sustainability in ways that recognise the psychological and social dimensions of the ecological crisis and promote compassion and agency needed for transformation. Brenda's professional background is in clinical psychology and also in yoga practice, theory, and therapeutics. She's specialised in individual and systemic interventions for young people, as well as in women's health, sexual assault. More recently, her work has featured preventative and trauma-informed interventions in school and community settings. In the year 2000, Brenda joined the Faculty of Social Ecology at the Western Sydney University, where she spent 21 years learning and teaching in this transdisciplinary field at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels. Brenda designed and taught a range of subjects, including eco-psychology and cultural change and education for sustainability. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to you two now, Brenda and Blanche, and they're going to have a conversation and we're going to listen for a while, and then probably around 7 o'clock we'll open up the conversation to include everyone. So please do include any questions that come to you as you're listening to this conversation, or any thoughts that you're having, and I'll be keeping an eye on chat and including those as we go along, and we will also make time to circle back to some of those questions at the end of this conversation. Okay, so welcome. Hand over to you, Brenda.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for the opportunity. I was just saying, Blanche and I met previously just quite briefly at the Climate Wellbeing Network in Sydney, and we were just coming out of the smoke from all the fires up in Sydney in, what was that, beginning of 2020 maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, very nice to catch up with you again and to read your book, which has been, it's great to presence the issues, and for me particularly to be thinking about the crossover between psychology and education, because I guess I've been working in that space for a while, and I won't say too much more about that because I want to start by asking you a little bit of the context for the book. I don't know how many people have read it. It focuses on work that you've done with undergraduate students. Where did you begin with that? And what were you teaching? How did you find your way into it? And how did it unfold, I guess, is what I'm wanting to ask.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, Brenda. And also Beth, it's really lovely to be here and a total privilege to be in conversation with you all. And there's lots of people that I know in the room today as well. So thanks so much for coming, and lots of people that I've learned a lot from over the years. And so to answer your question, Brenda, I guess I got started on this journey. I enrolled to do a PhD. I don't know why, but I did. And at the same time, I had been tutoring casually at RMIT University for a few years, teaching in the Bachelor of Environment and Society degree there. And so at the same time that I started my PhD, I then was starting a job teaching climate change at RMIT. So it was a new course running in 2015, was the first year that we taught a course specifically on climate change. And I was really interested in climate change and wanted to do my PhD on that. But because I don't really know my way around academia that well, I'd ended up in an education faculty to do my studies. So it needed to be about education. So all of those things kind of came together, and I did my PhD in education, looking at the climate change education that I was involved with as a tertiary educator. And as part of that, I had these sort of theoretical questions that I wanted to ask about, how we make sense of action in a world where it's clear that it's not just up to our human intentions as to what happens, but obviously the climate is a big complex system, is doing its own thing. Like we say that climate change is human induced, but it's not intentionally human induced. We're not in control of it. It's we're messing with it, and it's doing these things that we don't want it to do, didn't know that it would do, can't really work out how to make it fit in with what we want. So I had these questions around that. But as I was teaching that course, it became just really hard not to acknowledge how emotional my students were, and also me as well, in that course, and thinking about why it was different when we were studying climate change rather than the other courses on sustainability that I taught. And, reflecting on that, I think part of it was about a deep dive into one issue rather than kind of, looking at a different issue week to week. But I think part of the features of climate change that made it more emotionally challenging than other sustainability problems is just how, really globally, just how global the problem is, in that it's hard to see a really local solution. Obviously, there are lots of local solutions, but unlike, say, water pollution or, food justice or something where there's like a really clear ability to prevent that issue at a local scale affecting your local community, it was so global, meaning that I think these issues of people's sense of personal agency and, ability to have the kind of influence they want was really deeply undermined. And so, not only are the impacts of it upsetting, like a lot of other issues, I think just people's ability to feel like they're having a meaningful impact was really challenging. And at the same time around then, sort of after that semester in 2015, I joined the group Climate for Change, which is how I know some people here, like Tony. And as part of that, at some point we had, I think, Carol come along from Psychology for a Safe Climate and run a workshop for us on climate grief. And then over the next couple of years, I had Carol, and then after that, Bronwyn Gresham come along and do some guest sort of workshops with my students around climate grief and ecological emotions and self-care and those sorts of things. And they were, you know, so effective. So yeah, that's sort of how I got into this space, was that it wasn't ever an intention of mine, but it was just something that was really hard to be a good teacher and ignore that was coming up for my students, and then to just grapple with, you know, how to respond to that as someone who's, you know, not trained in psychology or counseling or any of those sorts of things.
That's really interesting to hear, and very kind of present with the process. And I totally relate to that from my own position in teaching. And I want, you know, I think there's a shift. There needs to be a shift, you know, from the idea that we have it all worked out. I think that's been the tradition in university teaching as well. Well, here it is. We're going to give you the ideas and the answers. But, you know, as you've described, the issues around climate are evolving so fast and are so overwhelming, and the solutions are not obvious. And I think certainly for me over the years, and I'm interested in your perspective on this, the sense of responsibility to be there in front of undergraduate students, particularly when I taught undergraduate students who may not have had much engagement or awareness previously and are there to learn. And, you know, you are the bearer of some terrible news for many of them. And that's quite a difficult position to be in. So you're nodding. Was that part of the issue for you? I guess then reaching out to PSC and other people is probably in response to that, perhaps.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess there's a couple of threads there. So let me try to muddle through them. One of my responses to that is, that's sort of part of why I called my work, or the book, Learning to Live with Climate Change. The publishers wanted it to be Living with Climate Change, but I was like, I don't know how to do that. And I don't think anyone does. We're all getting along and having a go and making it up and learning together about what are we going to do and how are we going to make this viable or, you know, even positive in some times and places. And yeah, certainly as an environmental educator at university, it is a quite specific context, and it depends a lot on who your students are. So I've had conversations with other, you know, academics over the time who, for example, some people teaching like law at Sydney Uni who are sort of like, oh, my students, you know, they think they're going to run the world, and probably they are, and they don't think about this stuff at all. Whereas my students at RMIT, not necessarily from sort of working class backgrounds, but a bit less hoity-toity. So I was teaching in an environment and society degree. So the students who'd signed up to do that were already, you know, they'd come out of year 12 and said, this is what I want to do. I know I'm probably not choosing the study that's best for getting me a job, but I'm really passionate about this. And that's what they've signed up for. And within that role, I also had to teach students from other degrees who weren't the same sort of level of environmentally passionate. And so sometimes going from different classes would be like a real emotional roller coaster in terms of the kinds of emotions that you're sort of trying to elicit and the ones you're, you know, performing yourself. So, you know, with some students ending up in the kind of classic environmental educator role of, don't you know how bad this is? And then going to the class with the environment students and sort of having to say, I know that you already get this and we're not going to rehearse how bad it is, but let's work out where do we go from there. And so, you know, that was, I guess, a key challenge for me was how to, you know, this was back before the pandemic, so how to run across campus and sort of balance my own emotions to try to work with different students. And that, I guess, is even as blunt as when you're sort of trying to separate them into different classes that have different emotional registers, but evidently, you know, within any classroom, you know, the students are all across the spectrum in terms of where they're at and what they're wanting to get out of something. So yeah, it is certainly really challenging.
And particularly that, I think that challenge of how to deal with the overwhelming emotions and promote agency, as you said, you're constantly kind of working with that. I think it's on edge, I think. And I wonder whether you could elaborate a little bit of that. How did you, you know, by beginning to acknowledge the emotions, how did you go about that? And how did you find that enabled something else? And we'll come to all the things in your book, no doubt, but that process would be really interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Brenda. So I guess some sort of context for, you know, because my PhD had to be in environmental education. And I guess as I was doing this research with students, one of the things I was coming up with against is this sort of default assumption that in environmental education, we're trying to get people concerned, because once they're concerned, the assumption is that they will take action. And so sort of coming up against this and realizing, no, my students are already really concerned, but that concern is actually quite disabling for some of them, to the point of, you know, paralysis, or, you know, just being so overwhelmed, either in the sense of not knowing where to start or who to talk to, or feeling that it's all, you know, all doomed, the kind of cynical, apathetic, or doomer sort of perspective. And so the ways that I try to work around that, firstly, is, and I genuinely have learned so much of this from Psychology for a Safe Climate people, so thank you, is just trying to, first of all, get people to voice that. So, you know, as you say, it's not so common in academia as the teacher to say, hey, I don't know what we're doing or where we're going to start, but let's start with our feelings. Particularly if you've got students coming from, you know, engineering or business management who want to do it as an elective and are like, teach me to build a solar panel. And to then say, hey, I just want to know how you feel. Sometimes that's you know, not so well received. But I try to encourage people to say, you know, like whatever it is, are you bored? Are you resentful of the question? Like whatever it is that you're feeling, let's get that out and aired so that we can start from that point. You know, and I think there's important questions around how to do that safely for students. But in my experience, it's sort of been, for those students who are really overwhelmed, to hear that other people are as well, and that other people feel similarly, is really powerful, because that I think part of the experience of, you know, climate anxiety or whatever we want to call it is the sort of silence that surrounds the issue in our everyday lives, outside of activist circles, of course, that we think that we're the only person that we know that feels this way or is this concerned. And so there's a lot of isolation and loneliness that can come from that. And so it sort of seems counterintuitive, but in my experience, giving people an opportunity to share with each other about how upset they are about climate change was a really important first step to allowing them to create a sense of shared identity. And, you know, part of that sense of feeling overwhelmed and disempowered is part of the individualizing rhetoric that we've been sold around, you know, if you want to save the world, you need to be an individual hero. And if you can't do that, then there's no point. And so we know that collective action is the only way to really respond to this. And so building collectives has to be the first step. Before we can take collective action, we have to have a collective. And so for me, giving people space to go, oh, those people think and feel like me, is critical to that sense of agency that you're asking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think certainly in the work that I did in social ecology, the core emphasis in educating was about putting the students at the center. Okay, so this is not about me giving you the information. This is about we're making meaning out of this together. And particularly in this space, I would say, well, look, there's no solutions. So we've got to learn our way out of it together. And that's why I think, I mean, the learning, the education part is really, really, really crucial. But within that, I wonder if I could tease you out just a little more. So the way we bring the emotions in, and you mentioned, you know, you had your own feelings at the same time that you had to work through. And I wonder how that might have come up. Were there challenges with that? How did you share it with the students, or did it just kind of emerge? I know I've had times when my voice cracked when I was teaching something, and actually, you know, in the end, I think it was useful. But I wonder what your experience of bringing your own emotion into it was, and then you know, how that may or may not have supported that evolution to agency that you were after.
Thank you. That's a great question, Brenda. For sure, there's been so many awkward moments. And through this experience, I've become, I think, a lot better at just sitting with social awkwardness and also unlearning expectations around professionalism, which we've all been through with COVID as well. But, you know, one thing I think as a teacher is we have both these sort of sometimes competing logics of one being a duty of care to our students, and also a sense of like professional boundaries. And so for me, you know, at that time I was in my late 20s, and a lot of our environment students come as mature age students, which really just means not school leavers. So they might be 20, 21 when they start. So not necessarily old, but not that much younger than me. So in that situation for me, there's a lot of social similarities between myself and my students. And one thing I just found was the expectation of these kind of cold professional boundaries meant that I was sort of saying no or pushing back against an invitation or something from students, whether that was an emotional invitation or actually an invitation to an event that they were running or something. And what I felt was really important for them was to be building, as I said, a sense of community and belonging and feeling valued, and that needed to go beyond the ideas of like academic community or intellectual sort of belonging that the kind of rationalized neoliberal university is cultivated. And so, you know, what that looked like for me was basically like going to the pub with my students or going to their birthday parties and things like that, and thinking, I don't know if I have research ethics to tick this off. I don't really know what my university thinks about it, but we're all adults, and it's really weird when someone says, hey, I've loved what you've been teaching in this class or what we've been learning together, and I'm running, you know, this event at a local art gallery, you know, later this weekend, do you want to come? Or those sorts of things. And to then sort of say, no, like I can't do that because I'm a teacher and you're my student. Like it just seemed to be really counterproductive. So that was one of the ways that, I guess, just one of my experiences. And I guess some of my reflections on that was, and I've never really managed to speak or write about it, but was just how important friendship is beyond a sense of just community. Like community is important, but I think friendship goes beyond that to sort of saying, you know, like I really trust you and I really care about you personally, and that you're important to me, and also that we can have fun together. And yeah, that's just, I guess, one of my observations is how important that is, but that we don't really talk about it enough in thinking about social care and those kinds of things. I mean, maybe some people do, but I'm not saying no one's thought about friendship, just it hasn't come up in, the conversations that I'm normally having.
That's really great to hear, I think, and really important, because that quality of relationship between teacher and student is absolutely at the core of what learning is. And I'm drawing particularly on my yoga experience with a teacher, that where the focus is so much on the quality of the relationship as being the enabler of something more than just intellectual learning, but it carries that sense of agency, of being able to embody and inhabit the learning, I think. And of course, in this area, I mean, that was something that I used to say to my students, okay, we're going into this and it's going to be rough, but I'm going to be there with you. And I think that's what made the difference, that it wasn't a disembodied thing. Yeah. So there's so many things that I could pick up on, but I'd like to invite you, Blanche, to talk a little bit more about, what you developed as you worked through. I mean, in the book, you talk about those processes of encountering climate anxiety first, and then witnessing, and then sort of building stories. Would you like to elaborate on that? I'm sure there's some people who've read the book, but there may be some who haven't, and it'd be lovely to hear you talk to it as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Brenda. And I will just say that you're testing my memory a bit, because, I haven't read my own book in a while. But
well, just riff on it however you'd like to, because, I understood when you write something, and then I'm assuming this has come from your PhD, that you write it in that time, and by the time it comes out and everybody reads it, your thinking has already shifted. So,
yeah.
so where have you got to? And I guess the other thing, just to give you another little handle, is, you talk about the importance of transformation, and that learning needs to be about transformation as well. So this is about you kind of articulating that process, I think, and where it could go. So maybe you want to speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you for the great questions and prompts. And I guess it's just a disclaimer in case I get a bit waffly, but bear with me. I guess so, because I was writing in education, and as an educator, those three processes or practices around encountering, witnessing, and storying were sort of what I was working up as the pedagogy, which for people who don't work in education is basically pedagogy means your theory and practice of learning. So how do people learn, and what do you do to cultivate that? So as I said at the start, I had these sort of theoretical aims and questions around wanting to rethink how humans are related or in relationship with climate change. And so that's kind of the theory that's popping up in those practices or the pedagogy. And so the first one is around encountering, and the reason for framing that as, I guess, the first one was trying to, think these big questions around what it means to be a human in this time that, some people are calling the Anthropocene, the time of humans or the time of man, and how we might, what are the implications of really thinking that through. What effect are we having in the world? What lives are possible for us? And as a sociologist, what kinds of being human are becoming possible in these times? And so I guess, coming from Western philosophies, obsession with humans, particularly white male humans, and this ideal of people being autonomous and rational and able to, entrepreneurial kinds of individuals who can, know what they want and can go and get it and make it happen. So trying to push back against that. And so this idea of encountering climate anxiety is about being countered by climate change, and how the experience of climate anxiety is unraveling those notions of like the Western ideals of like white masculinity as a basis for being human, and how it undermines our sense of agency, as we've mentioned, and our sense of personal autonomy and our ability to, articulate our own personal identity, and how, so that's the idea of being countered or encountering climate anxiety is feeling undone by the experience, and at a, complete kind of social and personal loss for how to make meaning and make decisions and plan a future and be in relationship with people. So that's what that is about. And as a pedagogy, I guess it's leaning into that and asking students, as you said, Brenda, like, come with me on this. And I don't know where we're going, but we can go together and have a go and see where it takes us, and do that in community. And so witnessing and storing are sort of two, I guess, more refined or specific versions of encountering, where, witnessing is like paying attention to the world, and that's how we have encounters with climate change. But it's also about witnessing each other and listening to each other as we share stories about how we're encountering climate change. So they're kind of all interrelated in, the classroom practice of talking about how you feel about climate change. And the idea of transformation coming out of that was around how, if we're being really honest in our conversations about how climate change makes us feel, it's really hard to, constantly and comprehensively say, I know what I'm going to do, and this is how it's going to work, and it's going to work, and I'm in control, and I'm going to sort this out. So that the sense of the individual is constantly being undermined. But in its place, if we're careful, I think that's where the transformation can come. And this is the idea of living with climate change rather than trying to control it, is, creating some kind of sense of collective identity, or, person or subject. Subject is the word we would use in philosophy, but I don't expect people to grasp onto that. But some kind of collective identity or collective self that is no longer, I guess, obsessed with or expecting to feel good all the time, or that the world is in service of their sense of entitlement to feeling good, but a collective self that can, sit with the real discomfort and process what it might mean to be otherwise, to have other kinds of expectations, to rethink how we're going to be humans in these particular times and circumstances. And that ultimately, for me, in my experience, that, in this class, that started from getting people to share how they are feeling about climate change. So I hope that kind of thread made some sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's it's on so many levels. It's really important to rethink who we are as humans and what we're here for. And I think that's the challenge of the Anthropocene, this paradox that suddenly we've become the greatest force of nature as a species, not as everybody by any means. And yet at that point, we've really kind of lost control, as it were. So what does that mean? What does that mean that we have all this power, and how we're going to use it? So there's all of those issues in there. And and I like, very much the questions about that you raised about who we are as humans. And I've always found very inspiring from the Earth Charter that it talks about human development. We need to realize that human development is about being more, not having more. which obviously is quite profound. But I think that individualistic sense of self that and it's challenging us on so many levels, that we can't find solutions alone. We actually have to move beyond that. And in one sense, I think Western psychology in particular has really invested very much in building up that independent, individualistic sense of self. And that's something that, I certainly feel we need to question and we need to undo. Interestingly, there's been some work in the field of decolonizing psychology coming from India in particular, which talks about emotions not being understood as being individual, but as something about a relationship. And that's comes through very strongly in your work as well, is talking about that even emotions are not individual, they're embedded and they're connected with climate change. I'm going to read a little quote from your book that I was taken by. You said, affective transformation is a process through which we become climate change, transforming our sense of self and our understandings of where ourselves begin, end, emerge, extend, and dissolve. So that really, you talked about the collective, but also about the collective is not just with other humans, but with the world as a whole. Yeah, and the other piece that I wanted to invite you to speak more about is the notion of justice. I think you talk about affective justice. And maybe you could elaborate what you mean by that and how you see that playing out.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. These are really good questions, and it's good to be prompted to respond to them. Thank you for the careful engagement with my work. It's really, thoughtful. Thank you. I guess on the earlier one around affective transformation, I guess just to reiterate what you said, I suppose through that experience with my class, I was also trying to look at not just how humans change the climate, but how climate changes us. And so that was the idea of becoming climate changed, and how at the end of that semester and, every day since, but in my experience, living in this time of climate change is changing who I am or could be. And so, that to me is a really profound sociological shift, as climate change both has, its material local impacts, but also global consciousness and imaginaries around it. How we, are re-articulating our sense of ourselves in this time is really interesting to me. And the question about justice, I guess, I think it's really interesting to be in conversation with people, with psychologists in particular, because there's some amazing, absolutely amazing work being done by climate psychologists or psychologists working on the issue of climate change around the world. But I think there's also some fairly, I don't know if it's problematic stuff, but maybe it's stuff that we don't need, that's around, sort of how can we medicalize this issue and frame it. I don't think this is the intention people come with, but I think in some, for some people working in psychology, the default assumption is if someone's upset, there's something wrong with how they're coping with the world, and we could make them do a survey and measure just how, upset they are, and then look at how we can, what kinds of professionalized, medicalized kinds of services we can give them to help them cope with the world. And it's not that I don't think there's value in that, but there's limitations to what it can do when the world is really shit. And and that kind of approach isn't about helping people try to change the world, but is about helping them cope with that world. And so I guess for this question of justice, for me, part of it is about, you know, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not trained in counseling. I can't bring that work to these issues. And it's really important that other people can. But then I do have this question, sort of, what am I doing working on climate anxiety if I'm not a psychologist or a counselor? Like, what is my role here? And so and I don't know if it's evident yet, but I don't really know what my discipline is, but it's somewhere in social science. So now I'm going to say, as a political scientist or something, you know, bringing the lens of justice to it, to try to situate these issues as political issues that are caused, you know, not by someone failing to adjust to the world, but by fossil capitalism exerting extreme violence on people all around the world. So that's one thing that I think I can bring to these conversations, is to make the case that climate anxiety, climate distress, climate trauma is an issue of state-sanctioned violence that is being willfully, intentionally, and very well funded, you know, in the face of just, you know, all the evidence and reason not to, you know, that our governments are still funding fossil fuels. And then when we have bushfires or whatever, they say, well, you know, we're funding mental health services, so you can go and talk to someone. And it's like, that's important to have those services at that time, but while you're still making the problem worse, that's not a solution. So that I guess is the crux of the reason around situating it as a justice issue. And I think the other element to it is that, I guess, a bit of recognition that in my work, I've mostly worked with pretty privileged people. And as someone who'd always been concerned about climate justice, but then realized, you know, I'm spending all my time talking to white people about their feelings. Meanwhile, you know, there's people in Pakistan where millions of people are displaced by floods, and we're actually in an air-conditioned room, just like saying that we're sad. Just trying to think critically about, you know, what are the politics of that, and how do we go about, you know, supporting people who are quite complicit in the problem and who are, you know, not the worst off, but who deserve compassion and support nonetheless. How do we do that work in a way that doesn't accidentally recenter whiteness and white privilege or other kinds of privilege? How do we do it in ways that, you know, grapples with that real complexity? And I think the challenge of being complicit and vulnerable, like of creating your own vulnerability, but being unable to prevent it, and also feeling guilty about making the problem worse for other people, it is really incredibly difficult to sit with. So yeah, I guess those are my rambled thoughts about justice and how it connects.
I don't think they're rambled at all. I think they're really, really pointed. And I'm going to invite in a minute the other people in the webinar to come in with some of their thoughts. You know, I think you really pinpointed where the difficulties, I guess, with the system are. You know, including with the mental health system. And including on the social justice issues, because we might be talking about grief and anxiety and trauma as a kind of new thing associated with climate change. But when you work with First Nations populations, that's a lived experience going on for many years. And there hasn't been the space, in a sense, the room to, if I can put it this way, and others might have a different idea to this, but, you know, to indulge in just emoting because there was nowhere to go with those sorts of things. So I think, if what we're doing is cultivating greater empathy, that can then lead to more to the agency, then that's perhaps where it needs to go. And the other thing, well, a couple of other things actually. I was listening earlier today, as it happens, to a conversation between Damon Gamo and Paul Hawken, and they were talking about, how you deal with the anxiety, etc. And Paul said that that anxiety is there to tell you something, that something needs to change, that you need to take action, which I resonated strongly with. The other piece in this that I personally have been particularly concerned about, as I guess come back to specialise in working with young people, is the intergenerational injustice here, which is huge. And as you say, and we hear there's so many young people with issues of anxiety and climate anxiety, and the solution is, we need to train more psychologists. Actually, what we know about young people's anxiety is that it's very much dependent on what they see the adults around them doing. So if the adults are not actually engaging in taking action or enabling their agency and their voices, it's not surprising that they would be feeling high levels of anxiety. And I could go on about that, but I think probably, you get it. I think probably most of the people here kind of get that issue as well. So thank you so much. I think we've got the opportunity now to invite people to come into the conversation. I think, Beth, we want to do that via the chat so that we don't get all the feedback. Is that right? And really kind of interested in whatever, questions people have about Blanche's work, but it might also be about these points that have been raised about, the place and the positioning of psychology and how we work in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Blanche and Brenda, for such a rich conversation. There's so much in there that I'm sure we could unpack further, and that I'm sure many people have more questions about. You're welcome to put those questions in the chat. You are also welcome to unmute yourself and verbalize your question or response as well. Just bearing in mind, there are 23 people here, and just making sure that we are leaning in the direction of dialogue and conversation, more than just, stating thoughts and opinions. But we are very curious to make this conversational and include everyone else. So if anyone has a burning question, you're welcome to unmute yourself. I'll just switch myself to gallery. Perhaps you could also just digitally raise your hand. That's usually the most useful way for me chairing the conversation, to just see who'd like to speak, particularly if you have your camera off. You're also welcome to just physically raise your hand. And as I said, you're welcome to type in the chat as well. Does anyone want to kick us off? I can see the cogs turning. I know I've got a few questions of my own. Okay, perhaps I'll start with one of my questions. Well, I guess I have a few personal questions. I too find myself asking that question, Blanche. What am I doing working on climate distress if I'm not a psychologist or counsellor? So I'm also a researcher and a facilitator. But I think it actually opens up a really interesting space about, what are all the different approaches that we need in this space to climate distress, given that it is much larger than, say, a purely psychological issue. And what's your thinking about that? What do you tell your students when they're thinking about the direction they want to go in, and how they can incorporate this approach and this way of engaging with climate change in their work that might not be explicitly psychological at all?
Yeah, thanks, Beth. Look, it's certainly great when you're with people who are open to the interdisciplinary approach, whether that's within universities or in society more generally. when it comes to students, it is a bit tricky. Like I recently had a student who wanted to do maybe honours or masters in research and was unsure about whether to do it through the psychology department or maybe geography, I think. But, you know, like they're quite different pathways. And I guess I was struggling to envisage, you know, it's been, I think for me, a real process to work out what is my role if I'm not a counsellor, and particularly now that I don't have a job that involves teaching, because I think that's the other obvious kind of place to be doing this work. And then the other one is in community, but it's hard to get paid to do that. But nevertheless, there's amazing people doing that, lots of them here tonight. So, you know, I guess in the end, I was trying to envisage like how might that change in the future. And I can't really imagine, as much as I wish I could, that climate distress will be less of an issue in the future. And given how much, you know, airtime it's kind of got in the last couple of years, maybe like the last 3 or 4 years, it's really escalated in, I think, the public consciousness. I think, you know, that there will be more and more ways that people can, you know, be involved in supporting others through these kinds of processes. And I guess then the question becomes whether that's, you know, kind of one side issue among many that you're incorporating into some other work that's not like explicitly about climate distress, or whether you're wanting to do that as the kind of primary focus. But, you know, I think there'll be lots of need for this kind of stuff in like local councils. I think someone here said they're from the Northern Rivers who might be able, I've forgotten who that was, but might be able to speak more to that in light of, you know, recent events. Like, how do we in local places affected by disasters where, you know, for so long the response to disasters has been, oh, well, now we go into the recovery phase. But, you know, when we think about what, for example, Lismore and other places in the Northern Rivers have been through, and, you know, places in Australia affected by bushfires like a couple of years after, like one after the other. And, you know, with our knowledge about climate change, knowing that recovery's like it's not just this once-off event that we're going to then rebuild from and we'll be right for another 100 years kind of thing. So how people get through those really tough conversations in place, I think there'll be such important roles for people in their local communities, just around, you know, being a good community member and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It kind of leads, I'll hand over to a few of the comments in the chat in a second, but it kind of leads to the other, feels related to the other question for me around effective justice, as in affective. And I guess the role that people who are outside of the psychological professions have to play in highlighting and making space for emotional affect in areas and spaces that traditionally we thought of as just purely intellectual. And how do we chart that course between validating and raising up those spaces, but not, as Brenda pointed out, potentially recreating problematic dynamics around privilege where certain voices get a lot of airtime about their distress, while others who have been encountering this for, you know, upwards of 250 years are perhaps still kind of ignored. It's a very big question, I understand, but I'm just really curious about your thoughts on that, and if you feel like your students left your course feeling like, yeah, I could bring my emotional world to my work engineering this seawall, for example.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. I think certainly for the people working on climate change in the like harder sort of sciences, I think really struggle with this because, you know, the cultural norms of those jobs and disciplines, whether you're in the university or out in the real world, really prevent that. So, you know, every so often I'll have some kind of like climate scientist or engineer write to me and say, thanks so much. Like, I am not able to talk about how upset I am at work, because we're supposed to be, you know, professional and rational, and there's no time for that kind of thing. So yeah, I think there's still places where it's really hard to have those conversations and to be taken seriously. So, you know, I think there is always a role for normalizing that. And I think to touch on some of the things various people have said, that normalizing having emotions and that we're whole human beings, you know, if it's done carefully, should be a means to building empathy for other oppressed people and the challenges and the suffering that they experience, rather than saying, oh, that's crazy that you're upset about something. That must be the first time in the world anyone's ever experienced suffering and you're so important. You know, because, yeah, so I think we just need to be doing it carefully in a way that emphasizes that, you know, what we're calling climate anxiety is, you know, distinct but not unrelated to, you know, the extreme trauma, as I think Deborah mentioned, that, you know, Brenda, sorry, about that Indigenous peoples have experienced through colonization and theft of land and those kinds of things that are, you know, sort of the original ecological distress, really. So, yeah, I hope that kind of answers what you're asking. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. No, it does. I'm just going to hand over to Nina now, who's got her hand up. Nina, you're welcome to put your camera on if you like, or you can just speak your question.
Hello, can I just speak? Is that all right?
Yeah.
I am kind of at the very end of Gen Z and am a musician as opposed to like a psychologist, but I'm really interested in how to use music to kind of therapeutically engage with these and open up conversations about how we're feeling, because music's obviously a great place where it like goes direct to our emotions and kind of bypasses some sort of logic. Sorry, that was more of an intro to me, but in conversations that I've had during carbon literacy with kind of end of school age pupils, so in the UK sixth form, so like 16, 17, 18, because the way Gen Zers and that kind of age group I think you're talking about are engaging with information is so different from previous generations, like the way they follow influencers and the way they get information, and emotions are just manufactured, so you're not sure if it's the climate that's making you emotional or people telling you to be angry, and it's so confusing. How in those conversations, particularly ones where they kind of say a very emotional fact or say, well, avocados are terrible, how to, whether those of you who've worked with those kind of kids, how to not ignore the fact that they have, you know, engaged and presented some information, but if they're literally kind of spreading emotions themselves and kind of revving up other people, particularly with fake news, or that how you kind of deal that. And I mean, it's massively, that's what we're kind of talking about, how to be that champion who's kind of a steady middle point. If you have any ideas or practical suggestions or even words or phrases that you can use to kind of diffuse what might become tricky and kind of fact flying.
Yeah, thank you, Nina. That's such an interesting reflection and question. I think it's funny because I have worked with young people, mostly uni students, so not children. But the thing is, like when I've worked with students and their assignments have been go and investigate something on this issue, a lot of them have then gone and looked at social media and its role in like how young people engage with climate change. But then when I speak to them, like I'm not really on social media and I don't feel that I need to be to understand where they're at. So, and that kind of puzzles me because I do think I know that they're living a life that's very different to me. So it's possible that I'm completely missing some important details. But I guess my observation from that is that I think young people are, you know, super engaged with social media, but in a way, I think they're a lot more savvy about it than some of us older people. Like, they're a lot more reflective and know that it is manipulating them, even though they kind of keep engaging with it. I don't know. So it's something I need to think about more. But something you were saying made me think of some like Twitter conversation that I saw, because I'm occasionally on Twitter, by a climate communicator in the US, who the tweet was something about, don't climate scientists know that their social media is making young people on TikTok have suicidal thoughts? Like, they shouldn't be basically blaming climate scientists for making young people upset. And, you know, I think somewhere in the crux of that is a question about how do we responsibly share information on the internet about how bad and serious this problem is in a way that is not traumatizing, knowing that we're trying to speak to people who aren't engaged yet, but that in reality, the algorithms mean that the people who are most likely to see it are the ones who are already actually quite on board with what you're saying and already pretty upset. So I think there's some real logistical challenges in how to target your message to the people that you want it to go to, and not to the ones that you're going to make upset. But I think the other side of that is, you know, generally giving people the skills to know how to manage their own social media algorithms so that you tune out from the stuff that you don't need to see. So, you know, for young people who are really freaking out about climate change, you know, some kind of critical media literacy to understand that, you know, that's an algorithm reinforcing what you're seeing and why everything seems so bad and you're not getting any positive news stories. And, you know, I think there's both sides of it. There's the responsible communication, but there's also we need to enable people to know how to manage their own news feed kind of thing too. And then, you know, to respond constructively to stuff that is upsetting. All of that's very difficult to do, partly just through having, you know, access. Like, how do you actually get in touch with these young people that are far-flung around the globe, just, you know, on the internet? So I don't know if it's a very useful answer, Nina, but thank you for the question.
Thank you very much for answering that. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Just got a question here from Merle in the chat. Merle says, thanks for sharing your ideas, Blanche. I'm interested to learn more about what you've discovered about how the climate reality changes people, in particular emotional changes. And I also had this thought pop up, and I wondered if you have any stories about yourself or your students or people you've encountered. How would you characterize these climate changed people? What does that mean? What does that look like? Yes, good question. I think the first thing is probably that political ideology structures it significantly, and also personality type, and then, you know, position in society and that sort of thing. So with that in mind, going back to the demographic of students that I've worked with, you know, largely young, middle-class people in Melbourne, from, you know, maybe some from the country, but mostly from somewhere in the city, pretty well-intentioned, earnest, caring, lefty greeny types. So how they have changed is not necessarily the same as how other groups would. But for them, I think, you know, it's just hard. It's hard to express other than like just sort of becoming undone and like losing a sense of how to have a future. And I think that those types of people in those sorts of demographics are, you know, especially, I guess, prone to that by being, you know, kind of hyper empathetic people, like hyper
maybe not hyper empathetic or hypersensitive, but just those sorts of personality types that, you know, were already, you know, worried about other people, maybe have high risk perception. You know, like there's people in my family who I talk about this stuff all the time and they don't care, are completely disengaged, not worried about climate change at all. And, you know, there's something about them that's different, and they're not really affected at all, despite the very apparent disasters unfolding around us, you know, especially up here in Sydney, where, you know, we had like 3 months of bushfire smoke, couldn't leave the city because all the highways were closed, and yet my partner's kind of like pretty nonchalant. So, but I get, yeah, so it sounds like a fairly depressing sort of state to be in, but I guess the counterpoint to that is that, you know, I think for my students that the experience of meeting other people in the same place as them was really, you know, like it's a bittersweet experience. It's very meaningful, even though it's hard. And yeah, sorry, I hope that is somehow useful, Mel. Thank you for the good question.
I'd like to just say a little piece about that. I think it, you know, across teaching young people, young climate activists, older climate activists, young people who were pre-service teachers who knew nothing about climate, and working with younger people more broadly in therapeutic settings. I think, and the young people themselves will say it's affecting them differently. Some are becoming energized and activated, and sometimes quite angry also, which I think they have reason to be. You know, and others are feeling, maybe feeling overwhelmed and turning off, and others are I think some of their nonchalance is a defense. I mean, we know, you know, we're facing an existential crisis across the board, and I think it's the coping skills that we know from, or I don't know about skills, but ways of coping that we kind of know from psychology more broadly are kicking in, you know. So some people are really feeling it, some people are defending against it. That's what the climate denial is too. I used that in a workshop with some young people once who were worried about their anxiety, and the politicians not doing everything. And I said, you know, they're anxious too. But what they're doing is defending against it, pretending things are not changing. And I think that was quite liberating. But I think maybe that's an opportunity. Maybe that's an opportunity for PSC as well to as part of resisting the medicalization that can then want to kind of compartmentalize it and box it in and treat it, to actually kind of come back to what we're saying. Well, this is actually a normal, understandable reaction, you know, and it can take many forms. And then how do we respond as a whole community? And particularly if we're thinking about our younger people, we need to respond at that level, because it's not just about climate, it's about their futures as well. And those of us who are older are responsible, I think. So this is I think psychology has not just therapy in there, but ethics and development and a whole range of things that could be brought to bear. Anyway.
Yeah. I'm just going to bring together 2 questions from the chat, and then we'll go to Georgia, and then I think we'll probably wrap up because we're getting pretty close to 7:30. There's actually been 2 questions in the chat, one from Robert and another from Enliven Victoria, and I'll just paraphrase because they're sort of along the same lines. And this is sort of how do we navigate relationships with people who may be aware of climate change but aren't necessarily that worried? How do we talk to our family members, our partners, when there is this divergent level of distress? And that for some people, that gap is itself quite stressful and depressing. Just any thoughts that you have on that?
Yeah, it's so important and so difficult, and I can't say I've had much success in my personal life, so I don't think I'm really well placed to answer it. But I suppose there's sort of two things. One is, this was part of what I was interested in as a sociologist, is how people's relationships, including their interpersonal and family relationships, are changing, or, being contested and reformed because of climate anxiety. And I think for me, it's around finding people outside of my family that can meet those needs and help me feel okay and feel in community. And unfortunately, my family can't do that. I love them for other reasons, and they provide other kinds of support. But, the more that I try to push them, the more frustrated and hurt I end up getting. So eventually, it's not a great story. Like, I kind of have lost. But, for me, I felt there were more useful places to put my energy. That's obviously really hard if you live in a remote community and there's not that many other people around. But, the internet is a great resource in that sense. The other thing is, I think two things, again, sorry. One is having some group like Climate for Change, where they send in a facilitator, and it takes the pressure off you to be the one kind of asking your family to engage, but is a space where there's someone else holding a space and letting everyone speak about where they're at on climate change. So I've done that and found that really useful. It didn't, mean that everyone in my family is where I'm at, but it was great to have someone external, so it wasn't just a back and forth kind of argument. And then the other one is, I think, to ask them questions about their experience and where they're at and what it means for them, and then wait for them to come back with a question for you, rather than, saying, I'm really stressed about this, why aren't you this and that, but leaving it up to them, because, people in our families do care about us. But, I think there's probably some basics of good communication and relationship management that are useful there. But yeah, I haven't sorted it out. So if any of you find out the answers, let me know.
Thanks. I think we're all thinking about it quite a bit. Georgia, I'm going to go to you, but I do just want to flag we only probably have about 2 minutes left. So I'm sorry there's not a lot of time, but if you want to unmute yourself and ask Blanche a question, you're very welcome.
Good, thank you. I'm still sort of forming this thought, so hopefully I can articulate it. I found the point about framing climate anxiety as a political issue rather than an adjustment issue really interesting. And I suppose I'm just curious about how the two kind of intersect, I suppose, because it seems that obviously it's not a medical type of anxiety. It isn't an appropriate reaction to things that are going on. And I can see that there is then a place for psychologists and psychology to help people manage that. But I'm interested to know, what would the alternative approach to be rather than treating it as a medical issue? It feels like it might be sort of connection with similar others, like you were discussing with your students. But especially when sort of the climate anxiety might be holding people back or feeling overwhelming. Where do you see the intersection of treating this climate anxiety with psychology versus some alternative approach? I'm not really sure if that makes sense, but if you have any.
Yeah, I get you. Thanks, Georgia. Look, I think, and the thing is, I'm probably not the best person to answer that. Maybe many of the other people in the conversation here are, but I think there's lots of intersections, and I think that's the key word that you used, is that it needs to be an intersection. Like there's such a wealth of knowledge and skills and practices and theories from psychology and the associated approaches. But I think when that's taken as the sole or sort of siloed response is when it becomes problematic. I don't think it's problematic in and of itself, but I do think that our society has kind of cordoned off emotions into like, if you have emotions, then you must need to see a therapist and do not talk to anyone else about it except on Are You Okay Day. When in fact, you know, as we've been saying, we kind of need everyone involved in this, and it needs to be in community. But you know, I look at the work that groups like Psychology for a Safe Climate do, which is, you know, ostensibly psychologists, but so much of what they're doing is actually around building community and bringing people together. And usually they're activists and giving them space to make connections with other people taking action. And so I think those kind of models where we're bringing the insights and tools and experiences of experienced counsellors into a less kind of clinical setting and more of a community setting is like pretty amazing. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I actually think that's a wonderful note to end on. And on that note, I would just like to kind of briefly wrap us up by telling you about things that we do have coming up at PSC that pretty much meet this exact intersection. So I guess first and foremost, I just want to put a plug in here. If you're not already a member of PSC, we'd love you to join. It's a really vibrant community. It's not just for psychologists, it's for anyone who's passionate about climate action and unpacking this issue in all of the different dimensions and layers that it has. And it's a really great way to support the work that we're doing. We're a majority volunteer-run organisation, and we really do run on a shoestring. So we really value people getting involved, participating, and you know, donating as well. The other thing I really want to point you in the direction of, which I can see Carol Ann wriggling in her seat about, is the wonderful climate cafes that our facilitator Carol Ann runs on the 4th Sunday of every month. There's a link in the chat there to the one that's coming up in September. There's another one coming up in October as well. And this is exactly the space Blanche is talking about. It's very open. It's a chance for people to get together, have a well-held and contained conversation that's still fairly unstructured, that gives a lot of space for people to share how they're feeling and what they might do from here, and listen to other people's experiences and stories. So really would encourage you to check that out if that's something that you've never experienced before. It's a really beautiful and welcoming space. And sorry for the many plugs. We will send you a little follow-up email as well with some of this, but we do have another conversation coming up in this series with John Wiseman on October 17th. There's a link for it there. And the last thing I'll just direct you to is our professional development, which it is for psychologists or people working in the mental health professions, really, and also facilitators. And we've also had quite a few researchers and academics come along. It's a series of 3, and it really takes you on your own personal journey with climate change as well, which we find is really foundational for anyone who wants to work on this issue and be able to talk with other people effectively about it. So that's my final plug and final link in the chat. Sorry to bombard you at the end there, but thank you all so much for turning up. There's lots of familiar faces and lots of people who've already done our PD. So it's really great to see you all and to feel like we're sharing this conversation in community right now as well. So if you want to unmute yourselves and say goodbye, now's the time. And yeah, thanks for joining. And thank you, Blanche, and thank you so much, Brenda, for your really thoughtful questions.